Hello and welcome to this Mastering Maya Advanced Digital Production lesson. Over the next several videos, we're going to be discussing concept art. So for starters, what exactly is concept art? Well, in a nutshell, it is just a fast representation of some aspect of your production. It could be a character, it could be an object such as an accessory or a vehicle or a building even, it could be an environment such as a landscape, all sorts of things. Anything that is going to be represented in some way in your production can be created through concept art. Now, what is the main purpose behind it? Well, really, you can sum concept art up in one word. Fast. It is a fast way to represent an idea visually. Because really, if you think about it, it's a whole lot quicker to sit down with a sketch pad and draw out some sort of character or object or anything that you need for your production and get it, just even if it was just roughed out on paper, it's so much faster than having to go in and model it and then lay out its UVs and then create a texture for it, even if your texturing is rough. I mean, if you've done any modeling, you generally have to create a UV layout for it, and then you've got to put in some sort of lighting, and then you've got to render it. If it's a character, you've got to rig it so that you can pose it or cover it in deformers. I mean, the list goes on and on with stuff that you got to do if you want to do all your conceptualization in 3D. Now, it's not to say you can't do concept art in 3D. It's just so much quicker if you can get yourself into the mindset of sitting down with pencil and paper, or what I'm doing, which is a tablet in Photoshop, and draft out some sort of an idea that you can quickly refine and work with. And that's what we're going to be covering over these next several videos. We're going to be putting together some concept art drawings of our Goblin character from our story. And I'm going to talk to you about how we're going to come up with our concept piece, even from establishing our general proportions, coming up with our pose, roughing in the shape, and all the way down to our final concept piece. Now, with that out of the way, in this intro, I want to talk a bit about these videos and how they're going to kind of be presented to you. First off, what exactly is this concept art video? It is my approach to coming up with concepts. So let me just spell that out for everybody. This is my approach. Now, why do I think it's important to tell you that? It's because my approach is not necessarily the right or the wrong way to do this. That's cheesy programming lingo for those of you who follow along with that. I'm not trying to pass this method or what I'm doing off as the way that you have to do concept art. You may already be an artist and you might say, oh, well, I would never create concept art like that. But this works for me, and it very well could work for you. Now, knowing that, I guess the next question would be, who is this video really designed for? Well, a big, kind of a wide range of people. Generally, though, I'm aiming this at beginner artists. That's right, those beginners who are just trying to get into the world of concept art. You're working on your production, and you're kind of lost as to how you can approach your concept art. Maybe you feel like you can't draw. Maybe you just, you're kind of afraid of touching a pencil to paper. And we're going to talk actually quite a lot about the various things that beginners have to deal with in terms of coming up with any drawing, even concept art. Now, this is also a good series of videos for established artists who just might want to see a couple, see another artist technique. You might watch what I'm doing, and even if you've been doing drawings for a while, you might see something that you hadn't quite thought of yet. So, keep an open mind. You might learn a trick or two. Now, knowing who this video is aimed at, kind of what this video is for, let's talk about what this video is not. This video is not your be-all, end-all drawing lesson. I am not trying to turn you into a master draftsman overnight. There are a lot of great established drawing curriculums out there that you can jump into. There are a lot of anatomy for artists books, and I highly recommend you get into that sort of thing. Understanding anatomy for any sort of character development is crucial. This is not, anything like life drawing, though, again, if you really want to take drawing seriously, I recommend you get into life drawing. That's where I began, and it really does make you very comfortable with touching a pencil to paper. What this is a quick, direct, down and dirty approach that can help even a beginner get some sort of insight, some sort of solid approach to creating their own concept art without having to feel like, oh, well, I should take, 6 months of drawing lessons before I start creating anything. Absolutely not. You can jump in and start creating concept work right away, very quickly and easily. And that's kind of the mindset I want you to be in, is that this stuff isn't hard, and that if you're patient with it, you can actually pull off some nice looking stuff. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's talk about the methods that I will be employing. in these videos, I will be using Photoshop and a Wacom tablet. Now, do you have to have Photoshop and a Wacom tablet to follow along? Absolutely not. No, you don't. You can do this on a piece of paper. You can do it with a line pad and a ballpoint pen if you want. If you're going to follow along using a non-digital medium, an analog medium, I would highly recommend, that you go with tracing paper and a light table. Now, if you're completely unfamiliar with a light table, it's a fairly simple contraption you can pick up at just about any art store in the world, and it is usually a small box with a clear or translucent top, and it's got a light bulb in it, and you lay sheets of paper on it, and you can see through. It's really good for tracing. I am going to be doing a lot of tracing, and I know that there are a lot of beginners who have this hang-up about tracing. Tracing is good. Tracing is your friend, especially if you're tracing your own stuff. And even if you're not, if you want to trace an existing drawing or an existing framework or layout or an existing pose or photograph, that's a great way to start getting your general proportions and general poses down. But in these videos, we're not going to be tracing any exterior stuff. Everything that we trace is stuff that we're actually going to create. But if you're new to drawing, I highly recommend go out and grab a sheet of tracing paper, which is fairly cheap, get a light table, or you can make your own if you're fairly industrious. I have seen a lot of people make their own light tables. I remember even once in high school, I made a cheap light table by buying, I think it was like a $2 picture frame that had a plastic overlay on it for the, instead of glass, it was like plexiglass. And then I just took a desk lamp that I already had and aimed it up at my face, laid the big sheet of plastic across my knees like a lap pad, and then when I put a piece of paper over it, it was a perfect tracing table. So, try to come up with ways to make it work. Now, I will say this. If you are following along in the analog sense, the colorization that I'm going to be doing is going to be a little bit on the tricky side, because I'm going to be using a lot of Photoshop-centric techniques to get my colorization in and make it look good. If you are following along in an analog manner, if you're using pencil, paper, ballpoint pen, whatever, I would highly recommend, if at all possible, that when you're done with your line drawing, that you scan it in and open it up in Photoshop and do your colorization actually inside Photoshop. You're going to find it's a whole lot easier to adjust colors, to lay down your colors in the first place. When you're done, you'll be able to go through color comps very quickly if you want to see maybe what your character or object looks like with a different scheme of colors. Very, very much recommend that you do your color work inside of Photoshop, if for no other reason than just that ability to make very fast tweaks and get an idea of what things will look like in different color schemes. Now, just one last thing. If you are following along using pencil and paper, please, please remember to draw lightly. You don't want to, draw it, grind down on your paper too much. But in the same vein, you always hear artists, especially art teachers, saying, draw lightly for that initial sketch. But always remember that if you're going to be tracing, at some point you're going to need to outline and trace back over your work to get a harder line, a bolder line that will show up on your next trace sheet. So just keep that in mind. Now, as we're working through Photoshop, I'm going to be doing a lot of stuff where I'll bring in a new layer, I'll drop on a new layer, take the underneath layer and bring down its transparency, and then we'll trace over that and start to get a clearer idea of what our drawing is looking like. Whenever I do that, you can consider, if you're following along using something like tracing paper and or a light table, that would be a new layer to you is a new sheet of paper. That's where you bring in a new sheet of paper and you'll just trace on what you did before. So keep that kind of stuff in mind, though just, again, if you can follow along with a program such as Photoshop, then you should, this should work out really well and should be a nice way to produce your concept art for now and in the future. Okay, so that is a quick overview of my method. Now, understanding all of that, let me use some of my mad Photoshop skills here, and I'm just going to nuke out all of this stuff that we don't necessarily need to see. And let's talk about some other stuff. And that would be a quick overview of our technique. So what exactly are we going to be doing? This is just kind of a primer to give you an idea of what we're going to be doing, how we're going to approach things. First off, we're going to talk about deciding on your proportions. Very important part of character development. You need to know, what are the prominent features of this character? What's big? What's small? Is anything exaggerated? If so, why? And this is based on a lot of your character development that you already took care of when you were drafting out your story. If you remember, we talked about, do that 20 questions for your character, and hopefully as you did that, you talked a bit about physical features on some level, and so you'll have that information on hand to help you come up with proportions and important decisions as to the look of your character. And do they have one leg? Do they have a peg leg? They have a big belly? Do they have are they skinny and lithe? Do they have long arms, short arms? All of that kind of thing will be decided upon beforehand in writing. Write it all down, and just if you haven't done it yet, sit down with a pencil and paper, or sit down with a word processor and pretend you can see your character in your mind and write somebody an email that describes them. Try to take somebody who's non-tech savvy and explain to them what your character looks like in words, and then review back to that once you're sitting down trying to decide on your concept art, and you'll find that you have a much easier time figuring out what is going to be what size and how things are going to be placed and all that sort of thing. Anyways, after we get our proportions decided upon, and once we're happy with that, we're going to set up our initial pose. Now, this is fairly easy. All of this is based on the fact that you know enough of your enough drawing skill. You have enough skill with a pencil or with a tablet stylus to be able to make a stick figure that is something like this. If you can do something like that, you should be able to follow along with each one of the steps that I'll be doing. So we'll start off with a stick figure where we adjust our proportions, and then we're going to keep those proportions in mind and come up with some sort of a pose. Now, if this is the first piece you've done for concept work, I recommend you don't get too outlandish with your pose, and of course we'll talk about that a little bit later, but try to keep a simple pose in mind, something that can get the point of the character across without going too far overboard. Of course, you can always save the hardcore, exaggerated poses for later after you've already got a couple of sketches under your belt. All right, now once we've taken care of our pose, we need to focus on the volume of our character. So this would be kind of a combination between pose and proportion, where you're going to, if you decided that your character needs a prominent belly, or they have big arms and big biceps, really buffed, kind of Gears of War character, very blocky and huge, then you're going to have to take some time and figure out the volume of each piece of their anatomy. And this is where you're just going to take that pose stick figure that you created and start to create some very generalized shapes. And it's just going to be a combination of things like rounded boxes and spheres and whatnot, just to give yourself some really simple idea of how big each part of your character or object happens to be. Now, once you've got your volume in place, it's time to start actually producing your drawing, which is going to take place in the form of outlines. And you're going to be tracing each one of these one over the other. And this is something, okay, that's driving me crazy. I got to make that look a little bit nicer. So, outlines with letter separation this time. And this is actually going to take place in multiple stages. We're going to do a really rough outline, and then that outline is going to get systematically better until, when all is said and done, we have our finalized line drawing of our character in his pose with the appropriate amount of volume. Now, once we have that line drawing in place, that outline, we're going to add in any accessories or clothing. Now, I want you to keep this in mind, especially when you're doing your own concept work. In general, I think it's a good idea to start off the basic construction of your characters as if they were nude, and that doesn't mean you have to, draw private parts and things like that. Just don't worry about the clothes right away. Build your base structure one thing at a time. Get the proportions right, get the volume right, get your outline in place where you can tell, what parts of the body are overlapping other parts. Then you're going to draw your clothes and everything on top of that. Because, how do clothes actually work? You put them on top of yourself, and the different motions that you make, the different poses you take on, are then reflected in your clothes. So let's come up with a character, then we'll apply any clothes or accessories, and they will already be deformed to accommodate whatever it is our character happens to be doing. Okay, now, once we have these steps in, we're still not quite finished, but we're getting there. The next step is going to be colorization. And this is going to be where we're going to come up with diffuse colors for each and every part of our character. Now, when I say diffuse, I want you to think back to skills that you already have with 3D applications, or hopefully you already have with 3D applications, because in a lot of 3D apps such as Maya or 3ds Max, your diffuse channel is always that base color, and that's exactly where we're going to start. We're just going to come up with a single base color that we're going to apply to the entire character, and then we'll modify that and take care of all of our shading and highlights over the next 2 steps. So once we have our color in, we can apply any shading, which is going to be darkening, and any highlights. Now, these are going to be very related to one another, and you're going to have to ask yourself some questions once you get into this area, like questions like, where's the light coming from? How many lights do you have? What sort of light? How bright is the light? Is the light colored? Let's assume that it's not, because that makes everything a whole lot more difficult. But you want to know some things about the lighting environment, and you need to know some things about the surface. So, if you're doing character skin, is their skin shiny? Is it dull? If they're wearing armor, as our knight character will be later on in the future, is that armor shiny? Is it dull? Is it rusty? Is it reflective in some way? You need to know about these surfaces, because that's where the shading and the highlights are really going to come to life, is when you know more about that surface and you start rendering different aspects of that surface. Okay, now once you have all that in place, it's going to be time for us to set up any adjustments that we'd like to see. And this is a really cool part of the process, because we can use the tricks that we already know in Photoshop, and some that I'll show you in case you didn't know them, to really quickly go through a variety of color comps. If we want to see what a character looks like with different colors on different parts of their body, we can do that very, very quickly using just a few Photoshop tips and techniques, if you will. And then the last step, and this is actually a really short step. This step might be as short as adding your signature, or it might have other things involved too. And that's just going to be your finalization, as I write letters out of order. And you can really, you can take that as far as you needed to. And this would be where, are you going to paint any kind of background for the concept work? Are you going to do anything outside of the actual design phase just to kind of bring it out? So that's everything we're going to be doing in this video. Now, as we progress, again, keep in mind, what concept art is. Again, this is just a representation of what it is we're going to be producing as a part of our production. A couple other things I wouldn't mind just kind of squeezing out. Don't be surprised if your concept art and the final model or final character that you have look a bit different. You're going to find that as you produce things in 2D, sometimes the things that you produce don't always translate exactly the way you think they will when you eventually make them in 3D. That's just the nature of the beast. And I might have already brought this up at some other point in the class, but one of my favorite examples of that is Mickey Mouse's ears in a lot of the old Disney cartoons, because as he turns his head around, the way he's been hand-drawn, you really couldn't get his ears to line up exactly if you converted those exact scenes to 3D, because his ears would always have to be in motion. They'd always have to be kind of wiggling around his head, because from some angles they're a little bit over-foreshortened or exaggerated. Sometimes they shrink. Sometimes they actually change positions on his head. And you're going to run into things like that, where you've produced something in 2D, but when you try to convert it to 3D space, it just doesn't work exactly the way you want it to. So expect certain amounts of discrepancy. But once you get your concept art done, once you've put your final stamp on it, you said, this is what I'm going to be doing, then you still want to, you want to stay true to it. That's the whole idea of concept art, is that you're getting a representation of what your object is going to look like, some idea of what it's going to look like when it's all finished. Now, when we're finished, when we've done this one concept piece, I don't want you, even if you're following along with me, or maybe if you're just using these techniques to create your very own concept art, I don't want you to think you're done there. Because all I'm doing really throughout these next several videos is just going through the process of creating a single drawing. And concept art is never really just one drawing. You're going to start over again. Take your proportions. If you like the proportions, then you can stick with them. Maybe come up with a new pose, or even just take your drawing and sit down with it, hand it out to other people, get some feedback, decide what you like, what you don't like, what's working, what isn't, how can you change it, how can you make it better, and from there you can create another work of another concept art piece. Maybe in a different pose. Maybe you decided that certain proportions were wrong, or that this particular color layout just isn't working for the character. Or maybe, this facial structure, it's just not really doing what you need it to do. You're going to decide on all that sort of thing and then go back and create another concept piece until you have one that has the look that you want. When you can finally say, this is what I want my character to look like. And even when you get to that point, you're not necessarily done, because even there it might be a good idea to produce another piece using the same proportions and the same color scheme and everything that you decided upon, but maybe in a new pose, so that you can start getting a clear idea of what this character will look like in motion, or what this vehicle would look like if somebody was driving it, or how this environment would look as you were walking through it. So all sorts of things you're going to have to keep in mind, and remember that it's more than just one drawing, even though over the next several videos I will just be completing a single drawing. So with that, I think we've covered enough information to get started, so let's jump right in and start creating the concept piece for our Goblin character.